That ugly scaffolding has to go, Colonel. It's a blight on this community, and you're already $3,000 in the hole for it. The voice, a grating mix of saccharine condescension and gravelly authority, belonged to Karen, the HOA president, a woman who moved through our quiet suburban neighborhood like a storm system looking for a trailer park to flatten. She stood on my perfectly manicured lawn, her floral-print muumuu a vibrant assault on the eyes, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a holy text. My daughter Chloe had just wheeled herself up the ramp in question, the beautifully constructed cedar-planked ramp that my brother and I had spent 2 weeks building so she could get in and out of her own home without my help. Karen's eyes followed her, but there wasn't a flicker of empathy, only the cold calculus of a bureaucrat assessing a violation. The scaffolding, as she called it, was the only reason my 17-year-old daughter could feel a sliver of independence after the accident that had taken the use of her legs 6 months ago. The $3,000 hole was the first I was hearing of it. A thick, professionally printed violation notice was thrust into my hand, detailing a $500 initial fine, plus a staggering $100 per day for 25 days. My blood ran cold, then hot. I'd spent 25 years in the Army, dealing with situations that would make Karen's meticulously coiffed hair stand on end, and I had learned to control my temper, to channel it into a focused, unyielding pressure. But this was different. This was my home. This was my daughter. I looked from the notice to Karen's smug, expectant face, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the carefully constructed walls of my composure begin to crack. This is the kind of neighborhood nightmare you read about online, the one that makes you shake your head and thank God it's not you. But now it is me, and I'm going to walk you through every step of how I took this woman's little kingdom of petty tyranny and dismantled it piece by legal piece. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, and while you're at it, drop a comment down below and let me know where you're watching from. Or better yet, share your own HOA horror story. We're all in this together. Now back to that Tuesday morning that started it all. Karen was still standing there, tapping a perfectly manicured, blood-red nail on her clipboard, waiting for me to grovel or argue or explode. I did none of those things. I folded the violation notice neatly in half, my movements precise and economical, a habit drilled into me over decades of service. Karen, I said, my voice dangerously calm, this ramp is a necessary medical accommodation for my daughter, who is permanently disabled. It is not scaffolding. It is a legal requirement for reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. She scoffed, a dismissive, airy sound. The covenants are very clear, Colonel Miller. All exterior modifications require prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. You didn't get it. Therefore, you are in violation. It doesn't matter why you built it. Rules are rules. They keep our property values high. She said property values with a kind of religious reverence, as if she were invoking a higher power that trumped federal law, common decency, and basic human empathy. I could see this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war. She was using the bylaws not as a tool for community governance, but as a cudgel to enforce her will. And in that moment, seeing the faint, triumphant smirk on her lips, I made a decision. I would play by the rules, but I would play by all of them, including the ones she seemed to think didn't apply to her. I gave her a short, sharp nod. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Karen. I will review the documents and be in touch. Her smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. She had expected a fight, a shouting match on the lawn that would give her grounds to escalate. I gave her calm, professional courtesy, and it unnerved her more than any outburst could have. She huffed, turned on her sensible shoed heel, and marched back toward her house, a battleship leaving a port she had just blockaded. I watched her go, the violation notice feeling heavy in my hand. $3,000. It was an absurd, punitive number designed for shock and awe, meant to force immediate compliance. But I wasn't a scared homeowner. I was a man who had planned logistical movements for entire brigades. This wasn't a fine, it was an opening salvo, and Karen had no earthly idea who she had just picked a fight with. She thought she was dealing with another resident to be bullied into submission. She had no idea that the illegal modifications she was fining me for were accessibility features required by the very ADA regulations my office was responsible for enforcing across 5 states. She had just tried to fine the regional director of the DOJ's Civil Rights Division for complying with federal law. My war wasn't going to be fought with shouting matches on the lawn. It was going to be fought with paper, and I was about to bury her in it. My first move wasn't anger, it was process. The military teaches you that discipline and procedure are your greatest weapons in a chaotic environment, and my home had just become a conflict zone. That evening, I sat down at my dining room table, the same table where Chloe used to do her homework before the accident, and I laid out my campaign. The first phase was appeasement and documentation. I had to create a paper trail that proved I had made every reasonable effort to resolve the issue amicably and through proper channels. This was critical. In any conflict, you must first seize the moral high ground and show that you were the party acting in good faith. I pulled out the massive 3-ring binder of HOA covenants and bylaws I'd been given at closing. For the next 3 hours, I read every single line, highlighting relevant sections on architectural modifications, the appeals process, and the fining structure. The language was dense, intentionally convoluted, designed to be intimidating and grant the board maximum discretionary power. But within the labyrinth of legalese, I found what I needed. Article 9, Section 4B, the process for submitting a modification request. I would follow it to the letter, retroactively. I drafted a formal letter addressed to Karen in the Architectural Review Committee. My tone was respectful, non-confrontational, and professional. I began by acknowledging receipt of the violation notice and expressing my sincere desire to bring my property into full compliance with community standards. Then, I methodically laid out my case. I explained that the construction of the ramp was not an aesthetic choice, but a medical necessity for my daughter, Chloe Miller, following a tragic car accident. I included a letter from her orthopedic surgeon and her physical therapist, both detailing her diagnosis of paraplegia and the permanent nature of her condition, explicitly stating the medical requirement for wheelchair accessibility to her primary residence. I attached a copy of the architectural plans for the ramp, which had been designed by a licensed contractor specializing in ADA-compliant construction. I pointed out that the materials used, pressure-treated cedar and powder-coated black aluminum railings, were consistent with the aesthetic guidelines for decking and porches outlined in Article 7, Section 2. I even included a materials list with receipts to show we had used high-quality, professional-grade supplies. Then came the legal part. I gently but firmly introduced the law. Furthermore, I wrote, I wish to respectfully draw your attention to the Fair Housing Act, 42 U.S.C. 3604, which requires housing providers, including homeowners associations, to make reasonable accommodations in rules, policies, practices, or services when such accommodations may be necessary to afford a person with a disability equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling. I quoted the specific language about the right to make reasonable modifications at the resident's expense. I didn't mention my job. I didn't threaten. I simply presented the facts and the law as any well-informed citizen might. The implication was clear. Without being aggressive, their position was legally indefensible. I concluded the letter by formally requesting a retroactive approval for the modification and the immediate cessation and forgiveness of all associated fines. I made 2 copies of the entire package: the letter, the doctor's notes, the architectural plans, the receipts. One was for my files. The other I prepared for delivery. The next morning, I drove to the post office and sent the package to the official HOA mailing address via certified mail with return receipt requested. This was another crucial step. It created a legal record that they had received my request on a specific date. No, we never got it excuses. I also sent a courtesy copy via email to the generic HOA board address, creating a digital timestamp. With the package sent, a strange sense of calm settled over me. I had done my part. I had been reasonable, professional, and thorough. I had extended an olive branch, albeit one reinforced with the steel of federal law. I had given them a clear, easy path to de-escalate the situation, resolve the issue, and avoid any further conflict. They could approve the ramp waive the fines, and we could all go back to being neighbors. My logical, military-trained mind saw this as the only rational outcome. But I had a sinking feeling that Karen wasn't a rational actor. She wasn't motivated by logic or community welfare. She was motivated by power. And people like that often see an offer of peace as a sign of weakness. While I waited for their official response, which the bylaws stated could take up to 30 days, I started phase 2 of my operation. Reconnaissance. I took a walk around the neighborhood, a friendly stroll on a sunny afternoon, but my eyes were scanning, observing, documenting. I saw a dozen minor infractions on every street, the kind of things a reasonable HOA board would ignore. A basketball hoop left out overnight, a small decorative fence around a garden that wasn't on the approved list of fence styles, a satellite dish installed on the wrong side of a roofline, and then I got to Karen's house. It was a veritable festival of violations. Her mailbox, a hideous faux stone monstrosity, was not the standard black postbox required by the covenants. She had unapproved solar-powered tiki torches lining her walkway. And, most egregiously, she had a massive 20-foot flagpole cemented into her front yard, flying not just the American flag, but a flag celebrating her favorite college football team. I checked the bylaws when I got home. Flagpoles were explicitly limited to a maximum height of 15 feet and could only fly the national, state, or military branch flags. Her little monument to herself was a clear, unambiguous, and long-standing violation. I took a few discreet photos with my phone, time-stamped and geotagged. The file on Karen was now officially open. The war was just beginning. The response came not in 30 days, but in 10. It wasn't a phone call or a polite email. It was a stark white envelope, placed in my mailbox by hand, bearing the official HOA logo. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter so cold and dismissive, it felt like a slap in the face. The letterhead listed the board members: Karen, president, a man named Gerald, vice president, and a mousy-looking woman named Brenda, secretary. The body of the letter was brutally concise. It stated that the Architectural Review Committee, which I had a strong suspicion consisted of Karen talking to herself in a mirror, had reviewed my unsolicited post facto application and had denied it. The reason given was a vague catch-all phrase pulled directly from the bylaws. The modification is not in keeping with the harmonious aesthetic of the community. There was no mention of the medical necessity, no acknowledgement of my daughter's disability, and certainly no reference to the Fair Housing Act. It was as if I had never written those sections. They had simply ignored the entire legal and moral foundation of my request. The letter concluded by informing me that the daily fines of $100 were still accumulating, and that if the unapproved structure was not removed within 14 days, the board would hold a hearing to discuss placing a lien on my property. My jaw tightened. The total on the original notice had been $3,000. 10 more days had passed, adding another $1,000. They were now claiming I owed them $4,000 for the privilege of my disabled daughter being able to enter her own home. This was no longer bureaucratic incompetence. This was malicious. This was a deliberate, targeted attack. They had been given an off-ramp, a way to resolve this without escalating, and they had floored the accelerator instead. I walked over to my filing cabinet and placed their letter neatly behind my copy of the packet I had sent them. The paper trail was growing. The contrast between my detailed, respectful, evidence-based request and their flippant, legally ignorant denial was stark. Any judge, any lawyer, any reasonable human being would see it for what it was. But Karen wasn't trying to win in a courtroom. She was trying to win in her own little fiefdom, where she was the judge, jury, and executioner. Her arrogance was breathtaking. She genuinely believed her HOA covenants superseded federal civil rights law. That evening, I sat Chloe down and explained the situation. I showed her their letter. She read it, her young face hardening with a resolve that reminded me so much of her mother. "They can't do that, Dad," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not just about the ramp anymore, is it?" I shook my head. "No, it's not. It's about a bully who's been allowed to run roughshod over this community for too long, and bullies only understand one thing." "What's that?" she asked. "Overwhelming force," I replied. The time for appeasement was over. It was time for phase 3, escalation and alliance building. I knew I couldn't be the only one Karen had targeted. Her type never has just one victim. Their power is built on a pattern of intimidation. I needed to find the others. My first stop was 2 doors down. An elderly couple, the Hendersons, had lived in their house for 30 years. Mr. Henderson was a retired history teacher who spent most of his days tending his immaculate garden. Recently, a series of small, whimsical garden gnomes had appeared among his rose bushes, a gift from his grandchildren. I'd noticed a few weeks prior that they were gone. I found Mr. Henderson watering his petunias, his shoulders slumped. I made some small talk about the weather before getting to the point. "Arthur," I said gently, "I'm having a bit of an issue with the HOA, with Karen specifically. I was wondering if you'd ever had any trouble." His face clouded over. He put down his watering can and sighed. "The gnomes," he said, his voice laced with a weary sadness. "She sent us a violation notice. Said they were lawn ornaments not in keeping with the approved aesthetic. Fined us $25 a day for each gnome. We had 7 of them. It was almost $200 a day. My wife, Mary, was so upset. They were from the grandkids. We couldn't afford a fight, so we took them down." My blood boiled. Finding a retired couple nearly $200 a day for garden gnomes from their grandchildren. It was monstrously petty. "Did she give you a written warning first?" I asked. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Just the fine. Showed up on our doorstep one day." This was a key piece of information. The bylaws, as labyrinthine as they were, clearly stipulated a written warning must be issued for a first-time violation, with a 10-day period to cure the issue before any fines could be levied. Karen was ignoring even her own rules. I shared my story about the ramp and the $4,000 fine. Arthur's eyes widened. "For your daughter's ramp? That's just cruel." "It's also illegal," I said, "and so was what she did to you. She's violating the HOA's own procedures." I could see a spark of indignation in his eyes, a flicker of the fight he thought he couldn't afford. "I'm not going to let her get away with this, Arthur, and I'm looking for other neighbors who feel the same way." He looked toward his house where I could see Mrs. Henderson watching through the window. He nodded slowly. "Keep me posted, Colonel. Mary and we're tired of being afraid to put a new welcome mat on our own porch." I had my first ally. The next day I approached the Garcia family who lived across the street. They were a young couple with 2 boys aged 8 and 10. Their crime? A portable basketball hoop that they occasionally wheeled from their garage to the edge of their driveway. I found Mrs. Garcia, Elena, packing her kids into the minivan for soccer practice. She was flustered, trying to juggle water bottles and shin guards. I introduced myself and explained why I was talking to people. Her reaction was instantaneous. "Oh my God, her!" she exclaimed, rolling her eyes. "Karen is a nightmare. She sends us a fine every single time the boys leave the hoop out past 8 p.m. $50 a pop. She must watch our house with binoculars. Last month we paid over $300 in fines because my husband had to work late and forgot to put it away." Again, I asked about a warning. Again, the answer was no. Just an invoice for the fine, stuck to their front door. "It feels like we're being extorted," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We've thought about moving. It's that bad. We just want our kids to be able to play in their own driveway." "You shouldn't have to move," and I said, my voice hard as granite. "You should be able to live in your home without being harassed. Elena, I'm putting together a case against her, a formal one. I have a background in this sort of thing. I'm going to hold a meeting at my house in a few days for everyone who's been targeted. Can I count you in?" She looked at me, a mixture of fear and hope in her eyes. "You really think we can do something?" "I know we can," I said, "but I need your story. I need everyone's story." She nodded, a determined look replacing the fear. "We'll be there. Just tell us when." I now had 2 families. It was a start. My little band of rebels was forming, and as I walked back to my house, I felt a familiar sensation, one I hadn't felt since my last command. It was the feeling of a plan coming together, of disparate units being drawn into a cohesive force with a singular objective. Karen thought she was fighting a lone homeowner. She was about to find out she was fighting an army. The next 48 hours were a blur of meticulous, focused activity. I drafted a simple anonymous flyer and printed a few dozen copies. It read, "Are you having issues with our HOA? Are you facing unfair fines or harassment? You are not alone. A group of concerned neighbors is meeting to discuss our rights and options. Your privacy will be respected. Join us at my address this Thursday at 7 p.m." I waited until after dark, and then, wearing a simple ball cap, I walked the entire subdivision, placing a flyer discreetly on the doorstep of every home except Karen's and those of her known allies on the board. I didn't want to give her a chance to preemptively sabotage the meeting. My gamble was that the sheer number of people she had antagonized over the years would be enough to overcome their fear of reprisal. On Thursday evening, I set up a pot of coffee and arranged the chairs in my living room, not sure if I should expect 3 people or 30. Chloe helped me set out some cookies, her expression a mixture of nervousness and excitement. At 6:55 p.m., the doorbell rang. It was the Hendersons, Arthur and Mary, holding a plate of brownies. A minute later, the Garcias arrived, their faces set with determination. Then another couple I didn't know, then another. By 7:15, my living room was full. There were 17 people packed into the space, a cross-section of the entire neighborhood. Young families, empty nesters, retirees, single professionals. I stood before them, a legal pad in my hand. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I know it's not easy to do this. My name is Mark Miller, and like you, I've had a run-in with our HOA president, a very expensive one." I briefly told them my story about the ramp, the fines, and the lien threat. A murmur of outrage went through the room. Then I opened the floor. "I know I'm not the only one. I'd like to hear from you. No story is too small." For a moment, there was silence. Then a man in the back spoke up. "She fined me for having a commercial vehicle in my driveway," he said. He was a plumber. It was my work van. I was here for 30 minutes unloading tools. The bylaws say no overnight commercial parking. She fined me $100 for a daytime stop. A woman near the front chimed in. She made us rip out our entire flower bed because we used white landscaping rocks instead of brown mulch. Cost us over $1,000 to replace it all. The floodgates opened. For the next hour, story after story poured out, a litany of petty cruelties and abuses of power. Fines for trash cans being left out an hour too long. Demands that holiday decorations be taken down on December 26th. Violation notices for faded paint on a windowsill, for a crack in a driveway, for a child's toy left on a lawn. A pattern emerged very quickly. The violations were almost always minor, things any reasonable person would ignore. There were never any warnings, just immediate, punitive fines, and the targets were often new residents, elderly people, or families with young children, people Karen likely perceived as less likely to fight back. I took detailed notes, capturing names, dates, and the specifics of each alleged violation. With each story, the collective anger and resolve in the room grew. They were no longer isolated victims. They were a group united by a common enemy. After everyone had spoken, I stood up again. "What you've all described," I said, my voice resonating with the authority I once used to brief generals, "is not the proper functioning of a homeowners association. This is a pattern of harassment and selective enforcement. She is using the covenants as a weapon to bully and intimidate residents. And much of what she's doing is not only against the HOA's own rules, but it's also against the law." I walked them through it. I explained the requirement for written warnings and a cure period, which she had systematically ignored. I explained how selective enforcement, punishing one resident for a violation while ignoring the same violation by another, can invalidate the rule itself. I showed them the pictures I had taken of the violations at Karen's own home, her illegal flagpole and non-compliant mailbox. The sight of that evidence sent a fresh wave of anger through the room. "But what can we do, mister?" Henderson asked, his voice trembling slightly. "She's the president. She and the board. They hold all the cards." "That's where she wants you to believe the story ends," I said. "But it's not. We have several avenues of attack. First, we document everything. I want each of you to write down your story, just as you told it tonight. Include dates, fine amounts, any correspondence you have. Bring it all to me. We are going to build a mountain of evidence." I continued, laying out the strategy. "Second, We are going to formally challenge every single fine. We will use the HOA's own appeals process to clog their system. Every appeal will cite the lack of a warning period and will include photographic evidence of similar, unenforced violations at the homes of board members. We will bleed them with bureaucracy. Finally, I played my trump card. And while we do that, I will be handling my own case. As some of you know, my ramp is a disability accommodation. Her refusal to approve it and her subsequent fines are a direct violation of the Fair Housing Act. This elevates the issue from a simple neighborhood dispute to a federal civil rights case. I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. I haven't told Karen or the board this yet, but my day job, I'm the regional director for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. I oversee the enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act in the FHA for this entire region. The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. 17 pairs of eyes were wide with shock and a dawning, brilliant hope. The Garcia's jaws were literally hanging open. Mr. Henderson looked like he was about to burst into tears of joy. So, I said with a grim smile, Karen hasn't just picked a fight with a retired colonel. She's picked a fight with the United States Department of Justice, and it's a fight she cannot win. The silence broke, replaced by a wave of excited, relieved chatter. For the first time, they saw a clear path to victory. The fear that had held them in check for so long was being replaced by a powerful sense of empowerment. We spent the next hour organizing. We formed a steering committee. We divided up tasks, collecting statements, researching state laws governing HOAs, drafting a petition to recall the board. We were no longer just a group of angry neighbors. We were a disciplined, organized resistance movement. As people filed out that night, they shook my hand, their faces filled with gratitude and determination. After the last person left, Chloe wheeled herself over to me. "You were like you used to be, Dad," she said softly. "When you wore your uniform, you gave them hope." I looked at her, my fierce, resilient daughter, the unwitting catalyst for this entire rebellion. "Karen started this because of that ramp," I said, nodding toward the front door. "She saw it as a symbol of defiance." Well, she was right. It is. It's a symbol of our refusal to be pushed around. And we're going to win this, Chloe, for you and for everyone here. The battle lines were drawn. The troops were marshaled. My next move was to let Karen build her own gallows. With my neighborhood coalition now secretly mobilized, my strategy shifted. I needed Karen to overplay her hand so spectacularly that her downfall would be undeniable. The perfect opportunity would be the hearing she had threatened to call to place a lien on my house. A public forum where she would attempt to humiliate me was the ideal stage for her own implosion. My job was to bait the trap. The first piece of bait was a formal, legalistic letter from me to the board. This time, I didn't write it as a friendly neighbor. I wrote it as a man preparing for litigation. I systematically rebutted their denial of my ramp. I cited the specific statutes of the Fair Housing Act they were violating. I detailed their failure to engage in the interactive process required by law when a disability accommodation is requested. I pointed out that their claim of harmonious aesthetic was legally insufficient to deny a reasonable and necessary modification for a disabled person. Then I addressed the fines. I stated that the fines were illegal on two grounds. First, because they were in retaliation for requesting a reasonable accommodation, and second, because the HOA had failed to follow its own bylaws regarding a written warning and a cure period. I formally declared that I would not be paying the fines, which had now ballooned to over $5,000, and that any attempt to place a lien on my property would be met with immediate legal action, seeking not only the removal of the lien, but also significant punitive damages and legal fees. I concluded the letter with a demand. I demand a public hearing before the full membership of the HOA, as is my right under Article 12, Section 3 of the bylaws, to address both the denial of my accommodation request and the board's pattern of procedural violations. I sent this letter like the first, via certified mail. I knew it would be like pouring gasoline on a fire. Her ego wouldn't allow her to back down in the face of such a direct challenge. She would see my demand for a public hearing not as a threat, but as a gift, a chance to make an example of me in front of the entire community. While I waited for the inevitable response, the neighborhood buzzed with covert activity. The steering committee worked like a well-oiled machine. We had a shared, secure online folder where residents uploaded their written statements and photographic evidence. The plumber provided a copy of his invoice showing the exact time he was at his house, proving it wasn't an overnight violation. The family with the white landscaping rocks found photos from the original builder's brochure showing that style of rock used in the model homes. The Hendersons, emboldened, provided a heartbreakingly sweet letter from their 7-year-old granddaughter asking why the mean lady made them hide the gnomes she had painted for them. Every document was a nail in Karen's coffin. My primary task was to assemble this information into a coherent, devastating presentation. I spent my evenings at the dining room table, not with military maps, but with property plats, bylaws, and spreadsheets. I created a master document, a timeline of Karen's abuses. I cross-referenced every complaint with the specific section of the HOA covenants she had violated. Then I created a second list, a catalog of every unenforced violation at her own home and the homes of her two board allies, Gerald and Brenda. The hypocrisy was staggering. Gerald had an unapproved shed in his backyard. Brenda had a garish pink flamingo on her lawn, a direct violation of the same lawn ornament clause she had used against the Hendersons' gnomes. It was a clear pattern of one set of rules for them and another much harsher set for everyone else. 2 weeks after I sent my letter, the official notice arrived. It was posted on the community bulletin board, and a copy was mailed to every homeowner. A special hearing of the Oakmont Estates Homeowners Association will be held on Tuesday, October 19th at 7 p.m. in the community clubhouse. The purpose of this hearing is to discuss the continued rules violation by the resident at 124 Willow Creek Lane, Mark Miller, and to vote on the authorization of a property lien to recover unpaid fines totaling $6,200. It was exactly what I wanted. She had taken the bait perfectly. She framed it as a trial where I was the defendant. She had no idea that I was the prosecutor. The night of the hearing, a palpable tension hung in the autumn air. The clubhouse, a sterile, beige room that usually hosted potlucks and children's birthday parties, was packed. Nearly every household was represented. My allies and I had coordinated our arrival, trickling in and taking seats scattered throughout the room rather than sitting in a single block. We needed to look like a crowd of concerned citizens, not a coordinated opposition. I sat in the front row with Chloe beside me. She was nervous but resolute. She had insisted on being there. "They need to see who they're doing this to, Dad," she had said. Karen, Gerald, and Brenda sat at a long table at the front of the room, looking self-important. Karen, dressed in a power red blazer, beamed with authority. She banged a small gavel, and a hush fell over the room. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "I know we'd all rather be at home with our families, but the board felt it was important to address a serious issue that affects the integrity and property values of our entire community." She launched into a 10-minute monologue about the importance of rules and the dangers of letting one resident flout the covenants that protect us all. She portrayed me as an arrogant newcomer who thought he was above the law. She never once mentioned that the unapproved structure was a wheelchair ramp. She never once mentioned my daughter. She held up a thick file, presumably my case file, and spoke of my refusal to cooperate and my belligerent correspondence. When she finally finished her tirade, she looked directly at me. "The board has voted unanimously to recommend placing a lien on the property at 124 Willow Creek Lane. We will now open the floor for comments from the homeowner before we proceed to a community vote." She smirked, believing she had already won, that she had successfully painted me as the villain. She leaned back in her chair, ready to enjoy my public humiliation. I calmly wheeled Chloe's microphone closer to her, then stood and walked to the podium. I placed a thick binder on the lectern, much thicker than hers. I looked out at the assembled faces of my neighbors. Then I looked directly at Karen. "Good evening," I began, my voice calm and steady, carrying easily to the back of the room. "My name is Mark Miller. Karen is right about one thing. This is a serious issue, but it's not about my ramp. It's about her." The trap was sprung. Karen's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. She clearly expected me to beg or argue about the specifics of the ramp, to plead my case as a desperate homeowner. She was not prepared for me to change the entire premise of the hearing. I let my statement hang in the air for a moment before continuing, my tone shifting from that of a resident to that of an investigator laying out a case. For the past month, I have been subjected to a campaign of harassment by our HOA president regarding a medically necessary accessibility ramp for my daughter Chloe, I said, gesturing to where she sat in the front row. For the first time, many of the residents seemed to truly see her, to connect the abstract, unapproved structure with the quiet, determined girl in the wheelchair. I have made every attempt to resolve this issue in good faith. I provided medical documentation. I provided architectural plans. I cited the relevant federal laws. In response, I received a dismissive denial and accumulating fines that now exceed $6,000. I paused, letting the injustice of that sink in. Karen has presented this as an issue of me violating the rules. But the evidence I have compiled over the last month tells a very different story. The real issue is that our HOA president, Karen, has been systematically violating the rules herself. Not just the HOA bylaws, but state and federal law as well. A gasp went through the room. Karen shot bolt upright in her chair. "This is out of order. This hearing is about your violation, Mr. Miller." I held up a hand. "I believe I have the floor, Karen. You said so yourself." I turned back to the audience. "This isn't just about my family. It's about the Hendersons, who were fined nearly $200 a day for garden gnomes their grandchildren gave them. It's about the Garcias, who have paid hundreds of dollars in fines because their children's basketball hoop was visible from the street. It's about the dozens of you in this room who have been targeted, intimidated, and extorted over trivial matters, always without the legally required warning period." As I spoke, Arthur Henderson and Elena Garcia stood up briefly from their seats in the crowd, silent testaments to the truth of my words. The other residents began to look around, murmuring, recognizing their own stories in the pattern I was describing. "This is what is known as selective and punitive enforcement," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "And it is illegal, but it gets worse." I opened my binder. On the first page was a large, clear aerial photograph of the neighborhood with several houses circled in red. Our bylaws are supposed to apply to everyone equally, yet for some reason, they don't seem to apply to our board members. I projected a photo onto the screen behind me. It was a close-up of Karen's monstrous, non-compliant mailbox. Article 5, Section 8. All mailboxes must be the standard black, post-mounted model. This is a direct violation. Click. The next photo showed her 20-foot flagpole. Article 6, Section 2. Flagpoles shall not exceed 15 feet in height. Another violation. Click. A photo of Gerald's unapproved backyard shed. Click. A photo of Brenda's pink lawn flamingo. A clear violation of the very same lawn ornament rule used to harass the Hendersons. Karen's face was turning a mottled shade of crimson. Gerald was sinking in his chair, and Brenda looked like she was about to be physically ill. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder, angrier. "So, this isn't about property values, and it isn't about rules," I declared. "It's about one person's abuse of power. But the most serious violation of all brings us back to my ramp." I looked directly at Karen, my voice dropping into a lower, more serious register. "Karen, when I informed you that the ramp was a disability accommodation, you dismissed it. You and your board illegally denied my request for a reasonable modification under the Fair Housing Act. You engaged in a retaliatory action by continuing to fine me for it. These are not just HOA violations. They are civil rights violations." I let that term hang in the air. Civil rights violations. It was a world away from arguments over lawn ornaments and mailboxes. "I had hoped to resolve this as a neighbor," I said, "but you have made that impossible. So you have forced me to act in my professional capacity." I paused for dramatic effect, my eyes sweeping the room before landing back on the board. "My name is Mark Miller. I am the Regional Director of the Civil Rights Division for the United States Department of Justice. My office is responsible for investigating and prosecuting violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act in this state." Complete stunned silence. The jaws of every single person in that room, including Karen's, were on the floor. The color drained from her face, replaced by a pasty white shock. I let the silence stretch, a tangible thing in the room, before delivering the final blow. 2 days ago, I filed a formal complaint on behalf of myself and 16 other families in this neighborhood with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD. The complaint alleges a pattern of discrimination, harassment, and illegal housing practices by this HOA board. HUD has accepted the complaint and has opened a formal investigation. They have, in turn, referred the civil rights components of the case to my office for review and potential prosecution. So this hearing to place a lien on my house is now evidence in a federal investigation. Every action you take tonight will be recorded. I close my binder with a loud, definitive snap. I believe that concludes my comments. Now I suggest you proceed with your vote. The room erupted, not in anger at me, but at Karen. People were on their feet shouting questions at the board. Is this true? Have you been breaking the law? My God, Karen, what have you done? Karen was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Gerald, the vice president, immediately grabbed the microphone. I had no idea about any of this. I relied on the president's guidance. The board officially withdraws the motion to place a lien on Mr. Miller's property. Brenda, the secretary, was already crying, but Karen, after a moment of stunned silence, found her voice. And what came out was not an apology or an explanation, but pure, undiluted rage. How dare you, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. You come into my neighborhood and you think you can threaten me with your fancy government job. I am the president. I will not be intimidated. But it was too late. Her authority had evaporated. The crowd saw her not as a leader, but as a liability, a tyrant who had exposed them all to lawsuits and federal oversight. Mr. Henderson, his voice shaking with newfound courage, stood up. I make a motion to remove Karen as president of the HOA, effective immediately. Second, yelled Elena Garcia from across the room. The chaos was complete. Karen was screaming, Gerald was frantically trying to restore order, and the residents were demanding a vote. It was a full-blown mutiny, and it was more beautiful than I could have possibly imagined. The trap had not only been sprung, it had been obliterated by the sheer force of her own self-destruction. The immediate aftermath of my revelation was pure pandemonium. Karen stood at the front table, her face a mask of disbelief and fury, screaming about bylaws and personal vendettas. But her power was gone. The residents, now armed with the truth and a powerful ally, were no longer afraid. They saw her for what she was, a petty dictator whose reign was over. Gerald, the vice president, a man whose spine seemed to be made of gelatin, was desperately trying to salvage the situation and distance himself from Karen. He quickly called for a vote on Mr. Henderson's motion to remove Karen as president. The result was a deafening, near unanimous aye. The only nay was a choked sob from Brenda, the secretary, who was more terrified than loyal. Karen stood frozen for a moment, then grabbed her oversized purse and stormed out of the clubhouse, slamming the door behind her. It was a stunningly undignified exit for someone who had ruled with such an iron fist. With her gone, a sense of collective relief washed over the room. Gerald, now the acting president, looked at me with the terrified expression of a man who suddenly realizes he's in charge of a sinking ship. Colonel Miller, Mr. Miller, sir, he stammered. What happens now? I walked back to the podium. What happens now, I said, addressing the entire community, is that we fix this. The federal investigation will proceed. It has to. The complaint is formal. HUD and the DOJ will likely require a complete review and overhaul of our covenants to ensure they comply with the law. They will probably mandate training for all future board members on the Fair Housing Act. This will be a long process, but it's a necessary one to ensure this never happens again. I looked around at my neighbors, but we can start the healing process tonight. First, I move that the board immediately and retroactively approve my accessibility ramp and void all associated fines. Seconded, came a dozen voices at once. The vote was unanimous. Second, I continued, I move that the board review every fine issued in the last year under Karen's presidency, and that any fine issued without a proper written warning and cure period be immediately refunded with a formal apology from the board. The applause was thunderous. The motion passed without opposition. Gerald and Brenda, eager to show their cooperation, agreed to everything. The rest of the meeting was spent setting up a temporary oversight committee, composed of myself, Mr. Henderson, Elena Garcia, and a few other residents who had been particularly wronged. We were tasked with managing the HOA's transition and cooperating with the federal investigation. It was the beginning of a new era for the neighborhood. In the weeks that followed, the changes were palpable. The HUD investigation was swift and thorough. Faced with the mountain of evidence we had compiled, the HOA, under legal counsel, entered into a consent decree. It was a legally binding agreement to reform their practices. They had to rewrite dozens of their bylaws, pay a significant civil penalty to the federal government, and establish a fund to compensate the residents who had been improperly fined. Karen, facing potential personal liability for willful violations of the FHA, sold her house and moved away in the dead of night. Her ridiculous flagpole was dismantled the day after she left, a symbolic tearing down of her regime. The Hendersons' gnomes reappeared in their garden, brighter and more cheerful than ever. The Garcias' basketball hoop became a permanent fixture at the end of their driveway, a joyful sound of bouncing balls now a regular part of the neighborhood's soundscape. The plumber who had been fined parked his van in his driveway whenever he needed to, without fear. The community began to heal. People started talking to each other more. The fear that had kept everyone isolated was gone. There were block parties and neighborhood barbecues. My family was at the center of it. Chloe, once the unwilling catalyst for the conflict, became something of a local hero. People would stop to chat with her when she was out, thanking her for her courage. Her ramp was no longer a point of contention. It was a landmark, a symbol of the community's victory over tyranny. One evening, a few months later, I was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Chloe wheeled herself out and sat beside me. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, just listening to the sounds of the evening. Kids laughing, a dog barking, the distant hum of a lawnmower. "You know, Dad," she said finally, "for a while after the accident, this house felt like a prison. The ramp. It was supposed to be about freedom. I hated that she tried to turn it into something ugly." I nodded, looking at the sturdy cedar structure. She couldn't see what it was, Chloe. She only saw what she wanted to see, a rule being broken. "But you made everyone else see," she said, looking at me. "You made them see that it's not about the rules, it's about the people. It's about being decent to each other." I put my arm around her shoulder. "That's the only rule that really matters in the end." We had won more than just a fight with the HOA. We had reclaimed our neighborhood. We had turned a symbol of division into a foundation for a stronger, more compassionate community. And as I sat there with my daughter watching the last light of day fade, I knew that this victory, the one I fought not in a foreign land, but on my own front lawn, was one of the most important of my entire life. Justice had been served, not just for me, but for everyone. The kingdom of Karen had fallen, and in its place a community was reborn.